He realized that we're not studying life, we're studying death. How do you learn what is happening with an animal? You kill them and you take out their liver and you sample the tissue and you look at gene expression. Whereas I think he sort of took the approach that you learn about life by observing nature. That's how you learn about what life is and what biology is.
We're in the midst of one of the most important paradigm shifts in the last 100 years. We're not on the cusp of it. We're not looking toward it. We're not on the fringes of it. We are in it. We are up to our waist, and pretty soon we'll be up to our eyeballs. And pretty soon the new paradigm will just be the way things are. And my guest today beautifully lays that out. We talk about how quantum biology ideally will become a phrase that no one uses anymore because it will just be generally understood that biology is quantum. It's all the same thing, and we won't need to differentiate it by using the term quantum biology. So in my wildest dreams, this podcast will be obsolete. That would be wonderful. Although I will miss talking to you if that happened. So I'm sure I would find something else to talk about. One of the wonderful things about the time that we live in now, one of the many wonderful things, is that we have this technology so that outsiders like myself can learn and talk to people who are working inside of these paradigm shifts, especially in the scientific community, and share those insights with the public. I think the public really wants to know when you look back at the quantum physics revolution 120 years ago, there were headlines all the time in all the newspapers around the world when there was a breakthrough in that science. Because I think people really care, even if we don't grasp the full details of everything that's happening on the scientific level. We can grasp the higher level meaning that it's going to bring to our lives and the shifts that it's going to make in our culture and in our civilization. And my guest today also does that, and he is masterful at it. Cameron Borg is the host of the Ricci Flow podcast, and he has talked with some of the most renowned scientists in the world in the realms of quantum biology and the changing landscape of how we understand health. He's made friends with them. He's introduced them to each other. It's been amazing. So I was really excited to be able to talk to him. Cameron Borg is a nutritionist, an educator. He has a Substack. If you don't subscribe to it and you like to go deep on these topics, I definitely recommend you find him on Substack, Cameron Borg, Ricci Flow, RICCIFLOW, Ricci Flow, which is an insider name for the super nerds out there. You know what Ricci Flow means. I didn't. I had to look it up, but now I do. And I'll leave that as a little Easter egg for you guys to hunt down. So Cameron came on and we had a really beautiful conversation just kind of about where things are in the paradigm shift and how amazing it is that we can, as relative outsiders, to some extent participate and share what's going on. It's really cool. I don't know, guys. It's an amazing time to be alive. I keep hearing from people who are like, "Oh, the world," and it's like, I know. There's lots of stuff happening, and it's an amazing time to be alive. And I'm so, so glad you're here with me. Please do help support this podcast by subscribing to it, leaving a comment. I used to hear from you all the time. I don't hear from you so much anymore. So please do leave a comment. I read them. It takes me a minute, but I do read them and I do try to respond to all of them. And, would love if you could do that on any of the apps where you get this. And also to support the people who support us at bondcharge.com for whatever you need to protect your circadian rhythms and get your red light therapy. Use the code QBC to get a little discount when you check out. And also do download my Circadian app and put the code QBC pod in the box when you check out with the My Circadian app. Again, an extremely valuable and useful tool. We talk about a lot of high level stuff in this episode, but then at the end, we get right back to brass tacks, which is, taking care of our light environment and all of the things, and having an app that helps us track and know what's going on, especially if we work with clients. You're going to want to get the practitioner bundle for that at the My Circadian app. And of course, please go to qbcpod.com for links There's extended show notes on there. I just redid how I did my show notes. There's lots of links to all the things that we talk about and tools I use. I've got some more products in there that I specifically use and recommend. And you can join the QBC free community. We do live free Q&As on a regular basis. And it's a great way to just like hang out with people who get what you're doing, support what you're doing. And that's it. Cameron Borg, welcome to the Quantum Biology Collective podcast. It is so delightful to have you here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure. I like being on the other end of the microphone sometimes. So,
yeah, on the receiving end of all the questions. Well,
exactly.
And that's why I wanted to have you here. So I'm sure most of my listeners are familiar with it, but if you're not, if you definitely go and listen to Cameron's podcast, it's wonderful. And you do such a beautiful job of helping to translate their science into something that the general listener can wrap their heads around. And now I'm going to get you to do that for us. So I want to start out just sort of how you explain what quantum biology is to people who have never heard of it.
Straight into the deep end. I like it. Fortunately, I don't have to explain this question very often. Otherwise, I think I'd be much more stressed out than I than I already am. It's inherently something that's counterintuitive because we don't really experience the world of quantum things. We more experience we feel much more comfortable with Newtonian physics and the physics of big things, the physics of large objects and things that are have definite place in space and time. And I wrote a very short piece of several months ago that was basically talking about what I call the problem with quantum biology. And I see the problem with quantum biology is the idea that there is a way to look at biology that is there's sort of two categories. There's regular biology, and then off to the side, there's this really niche sort of thing, quantum biology, and only weirdos go over there and study that. And I see the problem with quantum biology is that it gives the impression that there is biology that's not quantum.
Yes.
And of course, all biology is quantum biology. We live in a world that's made up of fundamental particles and forces that have different rules at the quantum level. So I think, something that we should be striving to do is to really normalize the idea that, quantum effects are happening in biology. Of course they are. How could they not? How could we have evolved? How could life have evolved over billions of years and not, make use of these crazy things that are going on that are so counterintuitive to us, but would be just standard for, abiotic metabolism, back 2 billion years ago. So that's sort of how I like to frame it. Now, of course, there's, a few classic ways to talk about quantum biology, with magnetoreception in birds being able to effectively, see, in quotations, see magnetic fields, and that's how they're able to navigate over such vast distances. And there's all this talk about electron tunneling in the electron transport chain. And although I've not read the papers, I believe that there is evidence supporting the fact that has happened. And you go back to, I think it was 1942, Schrodinger's book, What is Life? The most recent edition has a foreword by Roger Penrose.
Does
Nobel.
it?
Yeah, and he writes this great. I think that the foreword is only like 1 or 2 pages, and Penrose writes something along the lines of, how often do we hear that quantum effects could not hold in complex biological systems, basically intimating that of course these things are happening. How could they not be happening? And this was I think he wrote that forward in 1991. So even back then he was saying, how are we talking about this potentially, playing a role in biology? Of course it's playing a role in biology. And I know you've spoken to Bob Fosbury. He has the same, of course, it's not even a talking point to him. Of course it's happening. Let's move on.
Yeah, I know. He
So
seemed almost like annoyed by the question. It's like, well,
yeah,
of course it is.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think he had the same thing working with Glenn Jeffrey for the first time. You know, Glenn would ask him, "Do you think sunlight's going through the body?" And Bob was like, well, yeah, of course it is. You don't even have to prove that. And Glenn said, well, yes, we do. It has to be in the literature, otherwise no one will believe it. But, you know, there's so many things that to some people are so obvious, but to others are completely unbelievable. So, you know, the state of quantum effects in biology, I think, is only just starting. Luca Turin has done amazing work on olfaction, so sense of smell being mediated by quantum effects. I think Jim Al-Khalili and John Joe McFadden wrote about that briefly in their fantastic book. But I think we're at the beginning of understanding how many things are absolutely not only reliant, but they're built from the bottom up based on quantum effects. So I don't know if I've answered your question. Maybe I've just danced around it, but yeah, I think all biology is quantum biology.
Yeah, no, you answered it beautifully. And I think so too. I think of the quantum biology as like a placeholder until it just, the two concepts are so enmeshed in people's minds that we don't need the differentiator.
Yeah.
And yeah, that conversation where it's like, okay, well, maybe there are quantum effects happening, as you said, like sort of on the side, or maybe there's this piece, and it's like, no, I mean, if we live in a quantum universe and we're here, then this is it. This is the whole story, not a marginal piece of the story.
Yeah, yeah, I couldn't agree more. And you know, with that, we run the risk of sort of bastardizing the phrase. You know, having everything's quantum. If if everything's quantum, then it just sort of loses its meaning. So I think there is, we do need to be cautious with the way that we use it, because if it's used outside of its proper context, then, it can begin to lose its meaning. So I think there's, you know, a desire for quantum biology to become more accepted, but at the same time, we need to be careful not to set the field back uh, with a misuse of language or an overzealousness in a sense. But there are plenty of people who are working very hard to show quantum effects in a variety of different ways, whether that's to do with microtubules or that's to do with water, or even the quantum model of photosynthesis, which I think was 2007, 2006, 2007. Gregory Scholes and colleagues did, to show that there are, sort of delocalized excitons, making their way through the pigments to maximize the efficiency of the system. I think that is so translatable to biochemistry in general, and that really there's a deeper level that underlies all that we get to look at. When you do a blood test and you get numbers on a page, I think there's a basement level underneath that's all governed by these weird and wacky, very unconventional things that are going on at a level that's not very easy to understand. I think even Richard Feynman said something along the lines of, "If you think you understand quantum physics, then you don't,"
Then you clearly,
because because it's not meant to be something that's intuitive. It's inherently not intuitive.
right. Which is, I think, and this is all just, I'm learning as I go talking to people, but it has come to my awareness that traditionally biologists like things to be ordered. And biology has traditionally been a very ordered science. And asking that to open up into the world you just described, where it's like even one of the most preeminent scientists of his generation, like a Dick Feynman, can say, yeah, and we're never going to really understand what's going on. Like, that is really hard for uh, the scientific mind, I think, to feel comfortable with, because they are so driven to understand precisely how things work.
I mean, it's a classic problem that we face, that we have such a desire to zoom in so far that by the time we get down and find what we're looking for, we've completely lost sense of what it is that we're even looking at. I really like Rupert Sheldrake's takes on this. He as a biologist, he realized that we're not studying life, we're studying death. What how do you learn what is happening with an animal? You kill them and you take out their liver and you sample the tissue and you look at gene expression. Whereas I think he sort of took the approach that you learn about life by observing nature. That's how you learn about what life is and what biology is. And there's a great thought leader in this field, Eric Smith, who wrote a book with Harold Morowitz about the origins of life, essentially. And they sort of make the case that the only way to understand life is to uh, look at it from the context of life as an entire biosphere. You can't understand life in terms of objects. And he points out that Darwin, in his work, put a great deal of emphasis on the object, the individual, as the sort of passage of evolution. It all happened through the individual. And I think that that has sort of propagated through the common parlance, and the way that we think about life is that we think about life as this object is living, this object is not. And really we need to consider life as a collection of things that are all cooperating together. You can't reduce them really lower than that. And the only way you can think about life is as a biosphere, and the entire biosphere we have on Earth can't be reduced any further than that. But all we see is individuals, all we see is objects. But what we need to do, and the same thing, we do exactly the same thing with things like biochemistry. Instead of realizing that you can't really break down a human body into pieces and try and understand how they work, because the body needs to be understood as a single entity, because it is so interconnected in every single way, that the moment you sort of make two categories or more categories, which we're great at making categories and putting things into boxes. We have a great tendency towards doing that. The moment you do that, you've actually lost the very essence of how those units interact. And I think that this is just a mistake that we've inherited from the way that Western minds work. In the East, they didn't have the same issues that we seem to struggle with today. So it's not a logical consequence at all. It just happens to be the common modality of thought that we have grown up with. But it's by no means the only way to think about it. And I think we can sort of break out of that. And when you do, ideas like quantum effects in biology become very, very much more palatable, because you go, well, yeah, okay, this is starting to make sense. Like why would life not have made use of these sort of non-local peculiar effects of not even atoms, or we've got evidence of quantum effects happening at much larger levels than atoms. And John Joe McFadden, in his brilliant book, he's very ahead of his time. I think it was 2001 he published Quantum Evolution. He forwarded the hypothesis that he thinks evolution is taking place in a quantum superposition. There are these very interesting studies where you take bacterium that can't digest lactose, and you give them lactose as their only carbon source. And way, way, way more than you would predict by random chance, they develop gene mutations that allow them to digest lactose. And he has a very interesting hypothesis
Amazing.
about how that occurs, and perhaps the decision tree of which route to take in evolution is a quantum superposition. And when the right branch finds the solution, it collapses into that branch. And in that way, evolution is guided. I recommend people read the book. It's not one many people talk about, but it's a very, very good book. But
That
that's,
is
yeah.
wild and it sounds plausible.
I mean, I think you and I are both people who would love for that to be true, to be proven true. But yeah, I mean, these hypotheses are very interesting, and I think they should be dealt with seriously. because we don't really have another way of explaining how those types of things happen. But yeah, I mean, I think when you sort of uh, learn to lose a bit of the Western mind, and learn to sort of step back from that and realize that that's not the only lens to be looking at the world through. These ideas about quantum biology become much more palatable, and in some cases just completely self-evident. I mean, I don't think many people in the East would be very confronted by the idea of these sort of non-locality. That would be like, well, yes, of course, in a lot of parts of the world, but we really struggle with that, and it's very embedded into us from a young age. But it need not be, and we have uh, we have access to books and things that make it very easy to sort of lose that lens, or incorporate other lenses rather than lose the Western lens, because it's very helpful sometimes.
Yeah, I know it is very helpful, and but that commitment to the linear is not, it can't be the whole story.
Yes, and it
Uh,
is, that's a perfect way to put it, is it is a very, very strong commitment to linearity. And like, I find myself doing it all the time. All the time. It's very difficult to get away from it, because uh it's we've grown up thinking that that is the logical way to think about things, is linearity. But that's
yeah,
unfortunately not the way that it is with complex systems.
yeah. No, not at all, and we miss out on so much when we stay in that solely in that lane. Yeah, and I was gonna talk about this later, but here we are, so because I do think there is an interesting tension that I am certainly feeling, and you alluded to it with, our use of the word quantum. And I'd love to get your take on it. And because there is the deep academic work being done in the labs by people who see this as purely a hard science. And then way out on the other end, you have people, talking about it in what would be considered talking about quantum in what would be considered a much more sort of woo way. And I I personally feel like I'm in the seesaw, like I'm kind of sitting in the middle, seeing the value of both, but feeling that the academic side perhaps doesn't want to be tainted by woo, so is being extra careful not to be associated with it in any way. And, the more woo side perhaps rejecting some of that linear reasoning that could be helpful to explain what they perceive to be true. And I think as a culture, as a civilization in the West, I think you're right. In other parts of the world, they've perhaps are not experiencing this tension, but we are. And I think it's a growth process. And I'm just curious how you see navigating that.
I think my personal approach has been to only use the term when I am referring to something that is, referenceable in that sense. I find myself not having to use it very often at all, to be honest with you. And that's not to say that quantum effects don't underlie, the reason why sun exposure is so beneficial. Of course, the effects that underlie and mediate between the sun as the energy source of life and our body, of course, those are underpinned by quantum effects. But I'm very rarely talking about them specifically. And I think it just comes with, being careful with your word choice, which academics tend to be very, very good at. Not always, but you find them choosing their words very carefully,
Yes.
because when you're trying to submit papers to big journals,
Hmm.
they pick you out on absolutely everything. And you have to be extremely careful and cautious, particularly with ideas that are, let's say, pushing the boundaries. That's where you need to be extra careful. I don't think people are going to worry too much about the language if it's something that's very, very well established. But these things are going to take time. Unfortunately, we live in the real world, and the way to navigate that is to try not to bastardize the term, and usually you see marketers, people who are selling things, use the word quantum because that buzzword is associated with things that, bring in people's mind as, oh, this must be good then. So marketers are really, as is often the case, really the main culprits of sort of bastardizing the term. But we just need to give it time. Unfortunately, we live in the real world where these labs that are interested in quantum effects aren't getting funded, like other labs are. And we need to be cautious, and we need to, yeah, like I said, just use language very carefully. Language is so powerful, and there is plenty of evidence out there already that can be spoken about, and referenced very well, such that it doesn't lead to a bastardization. But it's the same with everything. We want to be careful. We don't want to set the field back, because that would not be so good. I mean, it happened in water research, didn't it? With Jacques Ben Venest and, all these things. The water field has been bastardized so many times that it just keeps pushing it backwards and backwards and backwards. And, you start to realize that even when the research does come out, I think, look, Montagnier's sort of DNA non-local sort of experiment has been replicated independently like 6 times now. You don't hear anyone talking about it because it was ridiculed so much at the outset that it kind of doesn't matter now how much evidence there is behind it. So yeah, we just need to be careful, and not to. I'm not at all suggesting that Luc Montagnier and those guys were not careful. Of course they were careful, but sometimes it doesn't matter how careful you are when you're that far ahead of your time. It kind of doesn't matter what you say.
Yeah, no, that's true. If there's a a mental roadblock, like a brick wall to certain avenues of research, shall we say, yeah, it doesn't matter. I mean, how much research there is, how much evidence there is, how careful everything is done. And I think that in itself sets things back, because then people kind of give up. They're like, well, I'm not going to bother to be careful.
Exactly.
No one's going to take it seriously anyway.
Yeah.
I just started a really interesting book called How the Hippies Saved Physics, but that deals with this question, and how it was some physicists in the 1970s where physics had become such a boring subject that they'd pulled all of the philosophy and all of the intrigue out of it in order to systematize it. And it became very boring, and enrollment was down, and nobody was excited about physics anymore. So they started this little club for where, if they talked about all the wild stuff. And a lot of the stuff that they talked about is still fringe, but they did anyway. The case that this book makes is that they did manage to like reignite the field. And so, yeah, it's definitely an interesting time. And I'm curious to see how things unfold.
And I think the line between art and science is sometimes thinner than people realize. I've been thinking about this a lot. I've been reading Ilya Prigogine's work, and back when he was getting into all of this, all of the dynamics, all of the equations that governed dynamics were time reversible. So you could run them backwards and forwards, and the same thing would happen no matter how many times you ran them backwards or forwards. It didn't matter which direction time was going, backward or forward. You're always going to get the same result. And Prigogine was a pianist. He was a classically trained pianist, and he was like, why do we only experience time in one direction then? If there's no favored direction of the arrow of time, why do we only ever experience it going forward? And of course, he went to show why there is an arrow of time, and he won the Nobel Prize for that. And I've been thinking about this a lot. I don't think he would have done that if he wasn't a musician. I think that there are insights that you can only get when your mind is sufficiently trained in a breadth of areas. And I think music is sort of, it's mathematics really. It's sort of the language of the universe. And I think really there are a lot of great insights that wouldn't have been made if it were not for the artistic intuitions of a lot of intellects. and Feynman's a great example of that as well. But yeah, I think the line between art and science is sometimes diminishingly thin. And in the same way, I think art and science belong together. I think science and philosophy belong together, which you could think of philosophy as a kind of art as well. And I think they're stronger together rather than separated. So yeah, that kind of sort of ties in a little bit with this conversation that we're having now, and it doesn't surprise me at all that the sort of counterculture of the 1960s influenced science. I mean, we keep coming back to Feynman because he's such a great example of this, but
Yeah.
the influence that art and culture have on science is very, very strong as well. And that's why we have such different ideas about what science is in the East versus the West. It's because, the questions that we ask in science are inherently grow out of the bedrock of the culture that we're in at the time, and what questions are available to be asked, let's say, are completely dependent on the culture. And uh, you know, there's an interview with Ricky Gervais. He's a famous actor, and
Yes.
he loves talking about atheism. He loves, and there's this interview he does where he says, "Oh, the reason I'm an atheist is because if you took all of the science away, took it away, and you took all of the religious stories away, and we started from scratch." He said all the science would come back exactly the same, but we'd come up with all the religions would be completely different. And I think the complete opposite. I think science would come back completely different because we'd be coming up in different cultures with different questions would be able to be asked. We would think about the way we do science in a very different way. And I think that the spiritual stories that we have, they come up over and over and over again because they're inherently archetypal. So I think the exact opposite of that. I think science, if we ran the clock back and started again, and culture was different, I think we may very well wind up with a very different science than we have today. I don't think it's a given that we would arrive in the place we have today at all.
Yeah. No, I agree with you because the idea that we'd have the same science is kind of predicated on the idea that there is a linear functionality to everything that we've figured out. And no matter what happens, we would have figured it out that way.
Yeah, I mean,
Mm.
it's like
But
Gerald Pollack mentioned in his Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life. He said if the protein component of cell membranes was discovered first, we would be calling it a protein membrane, not a lipid membrane. So it just depends. Like it depends on so many different things that are going on, and we sort of take for granted that science would always be like this. We would always find the same speed of light. We would always find the same things, and we'd always end up with the same frameworks to work with. But I don't think that at all. I think the opportunity for culture to shape the questions that are asked in science is so great. And of course it's so baked in we don't even realize it because it's everywhere. It's so ingrained we don't even have to think about it. It's just the way that it is, and we think that it's the way that it has always been and always will be. But science is an expression of the culture at the time, and
yeah, and it
it's
wasn't always this way. It used to be, I mean, there used to not be a differentiation. You would just be studying all of the things if you like back to medieval times,
mm, yeah. And scientists,
you
all
know.
scientists were philosophers, and all philosophers were
Yes,
scientists. Yeah,
exactly. And probably artists and writers and
exactly.
botanists and everyone just looked at everything. Yeah, no, we're in an interesting moment. And I do think too, like just, the you're talking about like the precision required to get approval when you have a new idea. And it's like even that framework in itself is changing how we do things. And the fact that you need this approval from like in order to get funded, in order to get published, and in order to have a career. And that has become the foundational driving force And so we have all of these brilliant people. I was just listening to your interview with Narosha. I mean, wow, she's amazing, right? And this brilliant person, but she's very much having to work within the confines and being very careful about what we know versus what we speculate, but also what we know might change. So we've been saying what we know is like it's wild.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to get into some practical applications. You mentioned earlier, Bob Fosbury and Glenn Jeffrey, and I think you introduced some of these characters to each other, maybe Scott and Bob, and so well done. We're all enjoying the fruits of their collaborations. This idea that the sun passes through the body, and Glenn Jeffrey published some research, and he was on Huberman. It was so exciting. So let's start with that as sort of like a new innovation in how we think about light, and talk about what that means practically. What does that mean for the regular person being like, what? Sunlight passes right through my body? Okay.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
I think the best place to sort of start with this is the idea that all of the energy on Earth is derived from sunlight. And the way that sunlight interacts with our atmosphere, at least now, means that the majority of the photons that come into the atmosphere are in the near infrared range. And there's not really a standard nomenclature about what is near infrared, what's red, what's infrared. Um, and near infrared is sort of the way that I like to think about it. And I could be wrong, but I think I've spoken to Bob about this, and he agrees that the way near infrared is differentiated from infrared is that near infrared operates in a tissue transparency window, and very importantly, in a water transparency window as well. Water tends to absorb infrared a bit more strongly, so infrared tends not to be able to get further in, whereas near infrared has this beautiful opacity through the body. Because it's not strongly absorbed by anything. There's no pigments there to sort of pick it up, and water, it doesn't strongly absorb it. So it's able to sort of make a passage through lots of tissues very easily, kind of like a pinball going all over the place, because it's bouncing off things and donating a little bit of vibrational energy here, bouncing off, donating a little bit of vibrational energy elsewhere. And so rather than passing directly through the body, it's doing a random walk all the way through. So, feasibly a photon could come in your chest and come out of your leg, because of the way that it's bouncing around. And because these photons stay inside the body for so long, relatively, basically when you go and stand out in sunlight, you're collecting photons in your body, and they're leaving slower than they're coming in. So you can imagine your body's gradually filling up like a balloon with photons, with near infrared photons in particular, because those are the ones that stay inside, bouncing around, donating phonon, so vibrational energy, all over the place. And there are a few notable things that actually do strongly absorb near infrared light, like cytochrome C. And the idea that you only have a few strong absorbers in a sea of weak absorbers means that you're much more likely for the near infrared photons to reach a strong absorber, because they're not absorbed along the way. And it seems like life has evolved to completely anticipate and expect that this stimulus is there, effectively all day long while the sun is out. And even when the sun goes down, the primary signature of light that you get outside is near infrared. That's the strongest part of the spectrum at nighttime. So even if you're outside and the sun's completely down, it's the middle of the night, the strongest signature of light is still near infrared. So it seems like what life has done is it has realized that there is this very, very reliable source of energy that we're capable of using. In fact, it's so reliable, let's base our entire metabolism off it.
Right.
And it seems like that's exactly what metabolism, at least in our branch of life, has evolved, going, okay, we've got these photons that are about 0.75 electron volts. Let's evolve tissue that is transparent in this region. So these photons don't get stopped at the surface. They can dissipate throughout the entire body. I think it's very easy to sort of see those pictures of Bob's hand over the near infrared light and go, wow, what a coincidence, this light gets through our tissue. No, we evolved to have tissue that was specifically transparent or opaque in the near infrared, because that's where most of the photon energy is. And we deliberately didn't evolve pigments to grab them, because we need those photons to traverse the body and interact with a lot of different things along the way, donating vibrational energy here and there, and reaching specifically important parts of the electron transport chain that use that energy to make things happen. And I think this idea that the entire body has evolved to use the majority of the photons that are coming in. And there's estimates that we have about 10 to the 21 ATPases in our body. I might be getting this slightly wrong, but the amount of near infrared photons per second is 10 to the 21. So you have all these sort of funny coincidences that sort of all point to the fact that we have evolved to expect this energetic stimulus to come in. Now, where this becomes difficult for people to understand is they go, okay, so energy is coming in, but we get our energy from food. We're not getting it. The energy, that's not usable. The sunlight's not usable because we think everything's calories. But of course, the energy that it's providing is not the same type of energy. It's not the same form that we think of with food. It's not chemical energy. It's probably doing it in the form of, like I said, these vibrational energies that help things get over activation energies. And what it seems to be is that the electrons that are trying to get through the electron transport chain, their path is expedited by the activation energy that's available in near infrared light. That sweet spot of about 0.75 to 1 electron volt that is in that near infrared zone. And essentially, it's not giving energy in the sense that it's giving us electrons like we get from food, but it's lubricating that whole process to make it maximally efficient. It's providing the energy to make that happen. And when you take that away, it still happens, but it happens at a much less efficient way. And I think that's sort of what we're experiencing now. Almost everyone in the modern world is running on 50% capacity and not even realizing it, because all of those activation steps that are required take a lot more work to happen. Whereas when you're outside in sunlight, our body's working the way that it has evolved to, by using that energy that we expect to be there all the time. So when I think about, or when I try and think about the way that sunlight interacts with us, it's really the fact that life has evolved expecting this input. And whether we know all the specific details about what's going on with different wavelengths and different parts of the spectrum, and morning versus midday versus afternoon light, we probably haven't even scratched the surface of all the details there. But what we can be sure of is that we evolved to experience sunlight from dawn till dusk, with no bouts of LED lighting in between. So let's not worry about the fact that we don't have all the details, because we have our evolutionary understanding as a brilliant heuristic to fill in the gaps. So when we think about sunlight, I really think, well, that's sort of where it all started. Everything is a result of the sun. All of the disequilibrium that we have on Earth is a perfect result of the sun and the magnetic forces that are going on from the core of our Earth. That interaction is what's providing disequilibrium on our planet that allows amazing things like life to happen. You look at Mars; it's pretty barren, and it looks like it's at pretty equilibrium, same as Venus and Mercury. These are not places that have disequilibrium, and we're just in that sweet spot, I suppose. And that's all thanks to the sun. So the sun really has to be framed as the center of our
Right.
understanding of life, in my opinion.
Yes. And I'm thinking now of John Joe McFadden's superposition evolution theory. It's like we collapsed. We collapsed around the branch that optimized for the sun.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's quite Lamarckian in a way, I guess. I hope I'm not putting words in his mouth that he would disagree with. But, it seems like evolution does not seem to be random. It seems like there's
Yeah.
some sort of influence that pushes things in the direction of more complexity. This is the sort of the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
If the second law of thermodynamics states everything becomes more disordered over time, then why has life become more complex over the 4 billion, or over the 2 billion years that we've had sort of multicellular life? It's the complete opposite of what the second law says. And this was a big challenge. This was what Prigogine really helped us figure out, and Schrodinger as well, about how we can battle against the force of entropy, and things becoming more complex over time. So
Right.
it's fascinating.
That in some way that complexity seems to be what we thrive on.
Yeah, well, the more complex you are, it seems the more you're capable of being negentropic. So the more complex you are, the more entropy you can dissipate. So there seems to be this force of life that pushes things to be more complex, in order to be able to dissipate entropy more efficiently. Because if you can dissipate entropy very efficiently, then you can maintain order. So I think that's really why there is this tendency towards more complexity. But there are many roadblocks in the way, and it may very well be that the endosymbiotic event of getting mitochondria that opened up an entire new landscape of energy transformation, maybe that only happened once, and it certainly seems that way at the moment, because bacteria and single celled organisms were, they pretty much look the same way they do now as they did 2, 3, 4 billion years ago. They sort of hit the ceiling of complexity. They sort of maxed out. They're as good as they can get, in a sense. But yeah, maybe something like an endosymbiotic event really opened up the door to allow complexity to take off, and that's the Cambrian explosion. You get that happy accident of oxygen being introduced into the atmosphere after the advent of photosynthesis, and you see these amazing things happening in a relatively short space of time.
And here we are.
Yeah, it's hard to
and,
believe.
and here we are sitting here, uh, blocked off from the sun. So I just want to recap just a little bit for my listeners. So essentially, the human body evolved and is designed to be outdoors collecting photons in order to function optimally. Is
Yeah, I
that
think I think that would be a hypothesis I would stand behind, is that it makes sense that if we have this availability of energy that is so unbelievably reliable, why would we not evolve our entire physiology around using it? And it seems like that's exactly what we've done. We have tissues that are completely transparent in the exact region where most of the solar photons are, and we have these steps between each protein of the electron transport chain, where the activation energy is basically exactly what you get from near infrared photons. I think it's too coincidental to think that it's just a happy accident.
yeah?
I think it's a pretty good hypothesis to say, well, we evolved specifically that way. Nature decides what's good. We just have to keep up with the
Yeah.
environment that we're
We
in.
just have to follow the rules nature laid
Exactly.
out. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where, that was how I came to this, because I'm not a scientist. I don't think like a scientist. I don't approach things in that way at all. So my take was, does it work? Am I going to feel better if I take this hypothesis to be true? And the answer was yes. And I see over and over that the answer being yes. So that, by your fruits you shall know them, right? Like if this was a faulty hypothesis, then I don't think we'd be seeing the kind of restoration in health that we see when people change their behavior according to these laws of nature.
And you wouldn't see the damage that's been caused by removing ourselves from the exact environment where
Exact.
where hypothesizing
Yes.
is optimal for us. Yeah.
Yes. No, I did an interview a couple weeks ago with a guy who developed full body psoriasis. He had it for 3 years. He would like his pillow would be bloody every morning. It was like really bad. He did all of the things, diets and supplements, acupuncture and like everything. And then he did he came into the circadian rhythm literature and the the infrared light literature, and within 6 weeks had reduced his symptoms by about 80%, and then over the following 4 months his skin completely cleared up. And it's like just by adding in all, what you've just been describing and basing his life around that.
Yeah,
So I'm
I
like,
mean,
okay.
I'm not even saying wow because I absolutely believe that. It doesn't surprise me one bit. Yeah.
Yeah. And then on the topic of adding things in, when we take away the barriers between ourselves and the natural world, because we are the natural world, uh, we tend to feel better. And when we put the barriers in, we tend to feel worse. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, the non-native electromagnetic frequency discussion. It was in the media this past January due to the football players. Uh, when Peter Cowan published his piece about the football players practicing next to the electrical substation, so that kicked open this conversation that the mainstream media did not know what to do with. So they just said it was a bunch of junk science, but it opened up the conversation in a way that I don't think has happened in the mainstream. And I've heard a lot of different opinions on the potential effects of that. So I'm curious where you land with it. Not
Um,
just electrical substations, but non-native, all of it, the whole soup we live in.
yeah, I mean,
The cell
it's
towers, the Wi-Fi, the
my
cell phones.
my thinking is that the things we should focus on the most are the aspects of our environment that have changed the most in the last, you know, 100, 200 years. I think that's a pretty logical approach, when if you're going to
Yeah.
take for granted the fact that okay, the diseases of modernity that we're experiencing now are not due to genes. If you take that for granted, then you have to go, okay, they have to do with our relationship with our environment. And then you say, well, okay, if I take that as true, which aspects of the environment do we look at first? And I look at, the various aspects of the environment, and a lot of them have changed in magnitude. So, for instance, our diet has changed a lot, but things like electromagnetic field exposure have changed not in magnitude, but in kind. We actually didn't get sort of radio frequency radiation, period, before 200 years ago. So this is a novel exposure, and in the context of our evolution, it's a hypernovel exposure. And I think we should focus on the hypernovel exposures, the aspects of the environment that have changed not in magnitude but in kind, because I think that's a logical place to go. Okay,
Okay.
these are probably going to be the things that are disrupting us the most. And the two major ones that come from that list are non-native electromagnetic fields, including light, right? That includes LED lighting and all
Mm-hmm.
of that stuff. It covers the whole spectrum. And also then you've got synthetic chemicals, which we'd never been exposed to before. So another hyper novel stimulus. Lucky for us, we get to be exposed to both at the same time. Um,
Yeah.
so my thinking is that just from logic alone, let's not even look at science. Would that not be a good place to start investigating? Because these are the aspects of our environment that have changed, not just in magnitude, but they're completely novel exposures that our entire evolutionary line has never experienced before. I think I don't think I sound very crazy by saying that that might be a good place to start investigating. Of course, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that there are notable, tangible biological effects from exposure. I think the epidemiology around cancer, for instance, is rather clear. But when you try and, this is something that Andrew Marino spoke about when I spoke to him, the problem with EMFs is their effects are so diverse because it depends on, 50,000 other things that are going on as to whether they might cause cancer, or whether they might give someone tinnitus but not someone else, or whether they might cause someone to prematurely gray hair and other people not. And he says the only way you can try and understand this relationship is by doing big epidemiological studies and looking at the net outcome. But the moment you try and look, does Wi-Fi radiation cause X disease? Well, that's where you start to lose things, because it might cause that disease in one person, but it might cause a completely different disease in another person, because what it is a very general perturbation to
Yes.
the very subtle bioenergetics of the body. You can't just overlay another signal. Our body creates its own. This is something Paul Heroux talks about. It's the principle of superposition. If you have a field and you put another field over the top, they superimpose and you get a different field altogether. And
Yeah.
that's what's happening when we're exposed to non-native fields, is that they superimpose. What are the effects of that? I have no idea. The effects that Wi-Fi router has on me might be different today versus tomorrow for me. It might be different for me versus someone who's a little bit shorter than me. It might be different for someone who has a different bone density to me. So there's so many variables that just make this an impossible topic. The way science is set up today, we will never, ever find any issues with EMF, because
Yeah.
the way that the science is done and the way that we look at these things is too reductionistic. But like I said, I'd rather stake my claim on just the logic of, well, should we not proceed using the precautionary principle if we don't know? The onus of truth is on the people who are irradiating us. It's not the onus of
Well, you would
proof.
think, and that's where I think that things get really wild, right? It's like they've rolled out all of these technologies decade after decade in more and more intense ways. And then they turn around and go, well, there's not a specific study to show that the tendon of an athlete has been affected by practicing every day on a field next to an electrical substation. So therefore, there's no evidence to show that that's true. It's junk science. Or whatever. Fill in the, I just use that example, but it's exactly your point. It's like we've been put into this experiment, and then the burden of proof is being put back on the people in a way that is impossible, almost
And it's
impossible to really
it's
show.
the same with synthetic chemicals. They get introduced
Yeah.
and then they say, "Well, prove to us that they're not safe." It's very backwards, and yeah, I'm as concerned as everyone else. I hope guys like Mike Levin are right. He seems not to be as concerned about EMFs. He seems to be more. I think I've heard him say something along the lines of, "I'm perhaps a bit more concerned about microplastics than my Wi-Fi
Mm,
router," or something. I hope to
right.
God he's right, because that would be lovely. That would take a lot of
Yeah.
angst off my shoulders. But I'm not sure he is. I think I think what we're seeing is the decline in health is going to be completely. We're going to be completely unable to unravel that from just the continual exposure that we have, continually increasing exposure we have to all sorts of electromagnetic energies. And I think it'll just become it'll become normalized in the data. You won't be able to untangle it. So yeah,
Yeah. Well, yeah,
yeah.
was it Andrew Marino's book where he talked about the experiments with the rats or the mice, exposing them to radiation, and some of the babies were twice the size they're supposed to be, and some of the babies were half the size they're supposed to be. So they're like,
So they
averages out
averaged it.
to zero.
Of
No
course,
effect.
what else would you do with that data? But this is unfortunately the way that these things are looked at, and I don't really see a way around it. I think Andrew Marino is kind of like you know, I'm at the end now, so I don't have to
Mm-hmm.
worry about it anymore. But, for someone like me who would like to have a family someday and would like to see the next generation grow up without, debilitating chronic disease, it's definitely something that you need to keep at front of mind, which is just an enormous stress to have on you when it's hard to be on a street corner without seeing a cell tower pointed directly at you. Everyone's got a phone in their pocket. Everyone works on a computer all day. It's very, very difficult. And I don't know what to make of it. I'd love to be wrong. I'd
Yeah.
love for it to be benign. I just don't think that it is.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think so either. Although I do think, and I've heard you talk about this as well, that different people, some people are much more affected and others not as much. And yeah, we just have to mitigate to the best we can. And
Yeah, and we don't know why that is. I think that's quite
yeah,
frustrating as well. If we could understand why electrohypersensitivity is why those individuals are so much more affected, at least affected so that they can perceive it. We may be affected in the same at the same magnitude, but we may not feel it, so to speak. We
right.
may not sense it. I think
That's true. There could be,
yeah,
we're like, no, I'm fine, but there's something brewing deep, deep
yeah. I mean,
undercover that we're not aware of. Yeah.
yeah, it's very interesting, and we should be trying to understand those who can sense them. Some people can hear very, very long wavelength.
Mm,
If I'm remembering correctly, I think Arthur Furstenberg wrote about it. But some electro hypersensitive people can hear them. They can hear cell towers and things like that. It would be great to understand how that happens because we could probably learn a lot from them.
yes. Yeah, there's so much to uncover, isn't there? And I think I want to end on something that, you've referenced throughout this conversation. And that's the idea of, okay, so what does this mean practically in the choices that we as citizens of the world need to make every day? And I deeply respect the scientific approach with its need for specificity and precision and being quite reluctant to say something is true or confirmed or known. I understand that. And I think it is an extremely important element of the soup. However, and this is why I have a podcast, when I started to research these topics for my own health, and as I said, I put them into practice and I felt better. And I see that happening over and over and over. I do get a little frustrated at the gap between what science will confirm and what the general public gets to know. Because, as you've been saying, okay, if we're wrong, so what? If it's a low risk to no risk intervention that in many cases doesn't even cost much money, why are we why is the system set up to kind of hold back that information, and how do we change it without, you know saying completely exaggerating and, as you say, misusing the words, but also letting people know, hey, heads up,
I think
we might be
there's
thinking about things wrong.
Yeah, I think there's an inherent risk at waiting for the system to change. I think the system will change based on enough individuals opting out. I think that's when the system will change, rather than us waiting for things to change. I think we need to be the change, and then the system will follow. We've seen this, so many times throughout history, and it's unfortunate because it would be great if we could have systems that are set up to really look out for us, but ultimately that's just not how things are set up today. And as far as where the rubber meets the road, what do I do? And that's what most people want to know who aren't science and who don't have a science background. And I would say that not having a science background is actually a huge step in the right direction for most people because being more intuitive about this helps way more than thinking about this scientifically. You stand to do things way better if you don't try and understand them at a scientific level, because all you wind up doing is making things more complex than they need to be. Wild animals don't need to think about what they're doing; they just do it, and they do it because it feels good and it feels right. And I think, we are domesticated animals, in a sense, and there is something of a disconnection between us and the natural world. As much as we would hate to cede that territory, I think that that's sort of where we're at the moment, and I think most people would feel some relationship with that idea. And I think just really trying to think as logically as possible. Does it make sense that, sitting under light that removes 90% of the spectrum that we've evolved for 2 billion years under? Are we really thinking that that's going to have no consequences, no effects? And I think the people who try not to understand it from a scientific point are the ones that get it and just go and do it, and they are the ones who are capable of doing it the best for a long period of time. So I would suggest to the people who actually want to know what to do, my first tip would be, don't try and dig into the weeds. It's really not necessary. If you like doing it like I do, then have a blast. We're very fortunate. There's so much information out there that you could follow. One lifetime's not nearly enough to get in on it all. But I would suggest to most people probably don't want to do that. And in that case, I would start just trying to think as logically as possible. People love to sort of rationalize, how much time should I spend outside each day? And of course, the question is, give me a number. And
Yeah.
of course, the answer is, well, as much time as you can possibly manage. The more you're outside, the better you'll do. And there's kind of a sliding scale where you get most of the benefits early on just by being outside for a short period of time, and then it, you get it's the 80/20 principle. And then it's like, well, you want to minimize your exposure to EMFs, unplug everything if you can, particularly at night. You don't have to be a genius, you don't have to have any sort of science background to understand any of that. You want to eat food that's grown locally and grown with good practices, and you want to eat it with people that you love, and laugh with them over the dinner table, and you want to rise with the sun and go to sleep when it goes down. And you really don't have to overcomplicate it. I think most people would be surprised to see the way that I go about things. It's very, very lax. I think it's easy to get the impression that people who are interested in this stuff like have everything dialed in. They're
Yeah.
counting all these things. I'm not like that at all.
Me
Sometimes you
either.
just gotta do what you can, and you've got other people in life that aren't as, they're not interested in it the same way that you are, and you have to make concessions sometimes. And I think just doing those small things, like I said, if you do the small 20 percenters, then you get 80% of the benefit from that. And from there, there's all the little rabbit holes you can go down into if you want to. But at the end of the day, they're just little rabbit holes. They're probably not going to buy you that much all the time. And I really think if you can eat well outside in the sunlight as much as possible, or if you're like me and you're living in Sweden, it's not very sunny, just getting outside anyway, even when it's cold, and trying to undomesticate yourself, whatever that looks like. That looks very different depending on where you are. But I think that's really where the rubber meets the road. Try not to look into it scientifically. Almost always going to just overcomplicate things.
I love that you said that. Yes, because that is, I think people need just enough of an explanation to be like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. And then that's it. They're
Yeah.
good,
And some
right? Like
people
they
just
don't
need
need,
to, yeah, I mean, just go stand outside in the sun. You tell me,
see
does
how
it
you
feel good?
feel. Yeah.
It feels great. Do
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Cameron, thank you so much for coming on today. This was a really wonderful conversation. I certainly enjoyed it. It was very edifying for me. And I appreciate your work so much. Please go and subscribe to Cameron's Substack. That is, if you like to dig into the science. It is, he's got some really amazing deep dives in there on various topics related to the true foundations of health as he discovers them. And again, Cameron, thanks so much for your contribution to all of us, learning to understand this.
Thank you for inviting me on. Very humbled to have been invited, and hopefully people found it useful.
Yeah, no, I certainly did. It was a conversation I really needed to have. So I appreciate you being here, and we'll do it again.
You have made it to the end of another episode of the QBC podcast. Congratulations and well done. Don't forget to visit us at qbcpod.com. That's qbcpod.com. You can find all of the episodes, all the links in the show notes, the tools that I use, links to the Institute, all of the things. And please do join the QBC free community if you haven't. That's where we send most of our updates. All right. Thanks for being here. If you also, please make sure you rate this podcast wherever you listen to it. There's so many millions of places these days, but it really helps. We really appreciate it. Thank you for being here.